The jar was cold in her hands. Mason glass zinc lids sealed tight in 1958 and hidden under floorboards that hadn't been lifted in 67 years. Maya Stone's fingers trembled as she twisted the lid. It didn't want to open. Rust had welded the threads together, time had locked them solid, but she kept turning because she had come too far to stop now. When the seal finally broke, it made a sound like a breath being released, like the house itself had been holding something in and was finally letting go. Inside, silver coins, heavy cold stacks so tight they'd fused into a single column of metal and history. 1890 Morgan dollars, 1921 peace dollars, half dollars with walking liberty on one side and an eagle on the other. She didn't count them. Not yet. She just sat there on the chestnut floor of an abandoned grist mill 2 miles into the North Carolina mountains and held a jar full of money that a dead man had saved for someone he would never meet, her. 18 years old, 5 feet tall, 100 pounds soaking wet, thrown out of her stepfather's house 3 days ago with nothing but a backpack and $214 she'd earned sweeping floors at a bakery before dawn. And now this, 12 jars, filled with coins and paper money and the carefully folded hope that someone someday would find them and understand what they meant. She did understand. She understood because 3 hours ago she had opened the 11th jar and found not money but a letter, written in pencil on paper that had gone soft and yellow with age, written by a man named Samuel Brooks who had run this mill from 1921 to 1962, who had saved every spare dollar for 40 years and hidden it under these same floorboards, who had written a letter to the future and trusted that the future would find it. The letter was in her pocket now. She could feel it against her ribs, the weight of it, the responsibility. Use it to keep the mill standing. The stones are good, the creek is clean, the wheel can be fixed. A mill is a useful thing. Maya looked around the room. Stone walls 2 feet thick, stained green with lichen and age. A fireplace built from creek rocks, its chimney rising through a roof that was missing a quarter of its shingles. 8 window frames, every pane of glass long gone, letting in the filtered green light of the forest canopy. A floor made of chestnut planks so old and dark they looked like they'd been pulled from the earth already ancient. Useful. That word had been circling in her mind since she read the letter, turning over and over like the grinding stones downstairs. Useful, not beautiful, not comfortable, not easy. Useful. She had never been useful. She had been small. She had been quiet. She had been invisible. She had learned to move through rooms without making sound, to eat without drawing attention, to exist in a way that required nothing from anyone and gave them no reason to notice she was there. That was survival. That was how you made it through a childhood in a house where your stepfather drank bourbon for a hobby and your mother had turned herself into a shadow to avoid being a target. But useful, no. Maya set the 12th jar down beside the others. 12 jars, arranged in a neat row on the chestnut floor. The last of the light was fading outside. The forest was going dark. She could hear the creek below running fast and cold over stones that had been there since before this building existed. A constant murmur, like someone talking in another room. A voice that never stopped and never got louder and never asked for anything in return. She had bought this place for $10. $10 and a signature on a deed at the Madison County Courthouse. $10 for 2 stories of stone and timber straddling a mountain creek. $10 for a building the county had tried to demolish twice and failed because no contractor wanted to haul equipment 2 miles up a footpath through the woods. $10 for a ruin. But ruins could be rebuilt, and $10 was all she had left after buying the truck. She stood up slowly. Her legs were stiff from sitting. She'd been on this floor for over an hour, opening jars one by one, counting nothing, just feeling the weight of what she'd found. It was getting cold. February in the mountains. No heat except what she could make with the camp stove she'd carried in. No light except the headlamp in her backpack. No sound except the creek and the wind moving through the hemlocks outside. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. And for the first time in her life, that felt like freedom. 3 days earlier, Maya came home from school on a Thursday in February and found her things on the porch in a black garbage bag. Not a suitcase, not even a cardboard box. A garbage bag, the kind you use for lawn clippings and construction debris, tied at the top with a yellow drawstring pulled tight. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at it for 3 minutes. Maybe longer. Time moved differently when you were trying to understand something your brain didn't want to process. The garbage bag was black and shiny, and there was a rip near the bottom where something sharp had poked through. She could see fabric, blue fabric, her favorite hoodie, the one with the hood that was too big and hung down over her face when she pulled it up. The front door was locked. She knew it was locked without trying the handle because Rick's truck was in the driveway and the television was on inside. She could hear it through the walls. A game show, audience applause, someone winning something, someone's day getting better while hers collapsed. She stood there and waited for something to happen, for the door to open, for her mother to come out, for Rick to appear with some explanation that would make this make sense. But nothing happened. The door stayed closed. The garbage bag sat on the porch. The game show audience applauded again. Maya picked up the bag. It was heavier than she expected. Everything she owned. Clothes, books, the laptop she'd bought used for $80. The Ziploc bag full of cash she kept in a sock in the bottom of her backpack. $214. 2 years of sweeping floors at 4:30 in the morning. She walked to the bus stop, caught the number 12 downtown, got off at the bakery. Ruth Callahan was still there wiping down the counters at the end of the day. She looked up when the bell above the door chimed, looked at Maya, looked at the garbage bag. "Sit down, sugar," Ruth said. "I'll make you some toast." Ruth was 62 years old and had arms like a longshoreman from 40 years of kneading dough by hand. She called everyone sugar regardless of their age or gender or whether she liked them. She paid Maya $9 an hour in cash and had never once asked why an 18-year-old was willing to show up at 4:30 in the morning without being told twice. Maya sat at the small table in the back of the bakery, the one Ruth used for paperwork and for eating lunch when she remembered to eat lunch. The table was covered in flour dust. Everything in the bakery was covered in flour dust. It got into the cracks in the floor and the seams in the chairs and the air itself so that when you breathed you could taste it. Wheat and yeast and the faint sweetness of something rising. Ruth made toast, 4 slices cut thick from a sourdough loaf she'd baked that morning. She buttered them while they were still hot, so the butter melted into the bread and pooled in the holes. Then she spread raspberry jam over the top, thick, the kind of jam with whole raspberries suspended in it like insects in amber. She set the plate in front of Maya along with a glass of cold milk and a paper napkin. "Eat," Ruth said. Maya ate. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite. She'd skipped lunch. She always skipped lunch. Lunch meant the cafeteria, and the cafeteria meant people, and people meant questions, and questions meant explanations she didn't want to give. But now sitting in the back of the bakery, with the day fading outside and the smell of bread all around her, she ate like someone who had been fasting. 4 slices of toast, a full glass of milk. She finished everything, and when she was done, Ruth took the plate away and made a phone call. Maya didn't hear what Ruth said. She was too far away and Ruth kept her voice low. But after 5 minutes, Ruth hung up and came back to the table and sat down in the chair across from Maya. "My cousin Merle has a property," Ruth said. She said it the way someone might say, "I have an idea," or "I heard something interesting." Casual. But her eyes were sharp and focused, and Maya understood immediately that whatever Ruth was about to say, she'd already decided it was the right move. "Up in Madison County," Ruth continued, "past Hot Springs, way back in the mountains. It's an old grist mill on a creek, stone building, 2 stories, and been empty since the 1960s. She paused. "He's been trying to sell it for years. Nobody wants it. Too far from the road. Too much work. Too much everything." Another pause. "Last I heard, the county put it up for tax sale at $10. Nobody bid." Maya looked at her. "You want it?" Ruth asked. "I have $214, Maya said. "It costs 10. What's wrong with it?" Ruth smiled, the kind of smile that says, "I'm not going to lie to you, but the truth is going to require some imagination." "Everything," she said. "The roof leaks, the water wheel is broken. There's no electric, no water, no road past the last mile. It's a stone box on a creek in the middle of nowhere." She leaned back in her chair. "But the stones are solid. The creek is clean, and nobody will bother you out there." That sentence landed in Maya's chest like a key turning in a lock. Nobody will bother you. She had spent her entire life being bothered, being watched, being managed, being made small by someone else's noise. Rick's voice when he drank, Her mother's silence when she didn't. The constant, low-level hum of tension that filled every room of that house like gas filling a space before it ignites. Every movement calculated, every word weighed, every moment spent trying to be invisible enough that she wouldn't become a target. The idea of a place where nobody would bother her, where she could exist without being monitored or evaluated or yelled at, where the loudest sound was a creak. That idea was worth more than $10. It was worth everything she had. Yes, Maya said, I want it. Ruth drove her to the Madison County Courthouse the next morning in the bakery delivery van. It smelled like sourdough and diesel. The passenger seat was covered in flour dust, and there was a coffee cup in the holder that had been there so long the coffee had evaporated down to a black ring at the bottom. The courthouse was in Marshall, a small town squeezed between the French Broad River and mountains that rose straight up on both sides like walls. The kind of town that looked like it had been dropped into a crack in the earth and left there to figure things out. The courthouse itself was handsome, red brick, white columns, the kind of building that was supposed to project authority and permanence, but mostly just looked tired. The clerk's office was on the second floor. The clerk was a thin man in his 50s with a mustache and a bolo tie. He looked at the property listing, then at Maya, then at Ruth, then back at the listing. The old Brooks Mill up on Laurel Creek, he said. That's the one, Ruth said. The man leaned back in his chair. The chair creaked. Everything in the building creaked. The floors, the doors, the old radiator in the corner that was putting out heat in rhythmic clanks. Miss, the clerk said, looking at Maya, that property is 2 miles from the nearest maintained road. The last mile is a footpath. There's no electric within a quarter mile. No cell service. The building hasn't been occupied since Samuel Brooks died in 1962. The roof is compromised. The floor may not be safe. He adjusted his bolo tie. The county tried to demolish it in 2008 and again in 2015. Both times the contractor said it wasn't worth bringing equipment up the creek trail, so it's still standing, barely. Maya reached into her pocket, pulled out a $10 bill. She'd withdrawn it from the ATM that morning. It was new, crisp. It didn't look like much. $10 wouldn't buy dinner for 2 people, wouldn't fill a gas tank, wouldn't cover a week of groceries, but it would buy a meal. She set the bill on the counter. The clerk looked at it, looked at her. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he picked up a pen. You'll need to sign here, he said, and here. Maya signed. Her handwriting was small and neat, the kind of handwriting you develop when you spend a lot of time trying not to take up space. She signed her full name, Maya Eleanor Stone, 18 years old, new owner of a 2-story stone grist mill on Laurel Creek in Madison County, North Carolina. The clerk stamped the deed, handed her a copy. Good luck, Bayonet, he said. It didn't sound like he meant it. Ruth drove Maya as far as the road went, a gravel Forest Service road that ended at a turnaround beside a trailhead sign. The sign was brown with yellow letters. It said Laurel Creek Trail, and below that 2.1 miles, and below that no motorized vehicles. Ruth pulled the van into the turnaround and turned off the engine. For a moment, they just sat there. The forest pressed in on all sides. Thick, dense, the kind of forest that looks like it could swallow you whole and no one would ever know. Ruth reached behind the seat and pulled out a paper bag. She handed it to Maya. Bread, she said. Cheese, a couple apples. Maya took the bag. It was warm. The bread was still warm from the oven. There's a payphone at the gas station in Hot Springs, Ruth said. You call me if you need anything. You hear me? I hear you. Ruth looked at her, really looked at her. The way someone looks at you when they're trying to decide if you're going to be okay or if they're making a mistake by letting you go. You're tougher than you look, Ruth said finally. Maya didn't know if that was true, but she nodded anyway. Ruth hugged her. It was quick and hard and smelled like flour and coffee and the lavender soap she used on her hands. Then Maya got out of the van, shouldered her backpack, picked up the garbage bag, and started walking. The trail followed the creek upstream, narrow but well-worn, packed earth with exposed roots and rocks that had been polished smooth by decades of rainfall. The forest here was old, tulip poplars with trunks wide as cars, hemlocks so tall you had to crane your neck to see the tops. Rhododendron thickets so dense they formed tunnels of green that the trail wound through like a thread through fabric. The creek ran fast and clear over a bed of smooth stones. It made a sound like someone talking in another room, constant and indistinct and soothing. The water was so clear Maya could see every pebble on the bottom, every piece of submerged wood, every shadow of a fish darting upstream. She walked for 45 minutes. The garbage bag kept catching on branches. She had to stop every few hundred yards to untangle it. Her backpack was heavy, 50 pounds at least. Everything she owned that wasn't in the garbage bag was in the backpack. Clothes, laptop, the Ziploc bag of cash, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, a headlamp, a water bottle, granola bars, a paperback copy of Walden she'd found in a free library box outside a coffee shop. The trail climbed gradually. The valley narrowed. The trees got taller and closer together. The light changed. It went from bright afternoon sun to a green underwater glow as the canopy thickened overhead. Ferns grew in thick beds along the banks, their fronds uncurling in the early spring air like slow green fists opening. Maya passed a waterfall, small, maybe 6 feet. The water dropped over a ledge of dark rock into a pool so clear she could count the pebbles on the bottom. She passed a stand of birch trees with white bark peeling in curls. She passed a pile of stones that might have been a chimney from a house that no longer existed. She was alone, completely alone. She hadn't seen another person since Ruth had driven away, hadn't heard a car, hadn't heard anything but the creek and the wind and the occasional bird call from somewhere high in the canopy. She was used to being alone. She had been alone in crowded rooms for years, alone at the dinner table while Rick drank and her mother stared at her plate, alone in her bedroom with the door closed and the light off, alone in the hallway at school, where she moved between classes like a ghost unnoticed and unremarked upon. But this was different. This was the first time being alone felt like something she had chosen rather than something that had been done to her. The forest didn't watch her the way people watched her. It didn't judge her or evaluate her or decide what she was worth based on how much noise she made. It just existed, enormous and indifferent and alive. And she existed inside it. And that was enough. Then around a bend where the creek made a sharp turn around a rock outcropping, she saw it, the mill. It sat directly over the creek, straddling it like a bridge, built from rough-cut stone, the blocks gray and green with lichen, fitted together without mortar in the old Appalachian style, each stone chosen and placed by hand to lock against its neighbors. The building was 2 stories, maybe 25 feet wide and 35 feet long. The lower story was the mill room, its stone walls rising directly from the creek bed, the water flowing through a stone archway beneath the building. You could hear it, a low, rushing sound, like the building itself was breathing. The upper story was the living quarters, 2 windows on each side, the glass long gone, just empty frames looking out into the forest like eyes that had been open too long. On the creek side, the old wooden water wheel was still partially attached to the building, but it was broken, 3 of its paddles missing, the wooden axle cracked, the whole structure listing to one side and covered in thick green moss. It looked like something that had been abandoned mid-motion, like it had been turning and then suddenly stopped and had been waiting ever since for someone to start it again. The front door faced the trail, heavy oak, hanging crooked on rusted iron hinges. One hinge broken, the door resting at an angle against the stone frame. The roof was wooden shingles. Roughly a quarter of them were missing on the left side, exposing the rafters. Thick ivy and Virginia creeper covered the right wall from foundation to roofline. Ferns grew from cracks in the stone near the creek level, but the stones were solid. Maya could see that even from the trail, even with the moss and the ivy and the years of neglect. The walls were straight, the corners were plumb. The foundation, which was the creek bed itself, was bedrock. This building had been standing here for over 150 years, and it looked like it could stand for 150 more if someone cared enough to give it a roof. Maya walked up to the crooked door, put her hand on the wood. It was cold and rough and solid. She pushed. The door resisted for a moment, then scraped open across the stone floor inside. She stepped through. The ground floor was the mill room, a single large space with a stone floor and a low ceiling of heavy oak beams. The grinding stones were still there, 2 circular stones about 3 feet across, one on top of the other, mounted on a wooden frame in the center of the room. They were covered in dust and cobwebs but intact. The mechanism that had once connected them to the water wheel, a system of wooden gears and iron shafts, was partially collapsed against the back wall. The wood was dark with age and moisture. Some of it had rotted, but the iron was still there, rusted but whole. The creak was audible everywhere, a constant murmur coming up through the stone floor and through the archway at the rear of the room where the water flowed beneath the building. It was louder here than outside. The stone walls amplified it, turned it into something you could feel as much as hear, a vibration in the air and in the floor and in your chest when you stood still. A narrow wooden staircase in the corner led up to the second floor. Maya tested each step before putting her full weight on it. The wood creaked and flexed, but held. The second floor was the living quarters, a single room with a plank floor, stone walls, and the 8 windows she'd seen from outside. No glass in any of them, just open frames letting in the pale green light filtered through the forest canopy. A stone fireplace stood against the back wall, its chimney running up through the damaged roof. An old iron bed frame sat in one corner, the mattress long gone, just the frame. Rust red and skeletal, a wooden table and one chair stood against the wall, both dusty but solid. The floor was wide chestnut planks, dark with age. When Maya stepped on them, she noticed immediately that several of the planks near the fireplace were loose. They rocked slightly under her weight, a subtle movement that most people would have missed. But Maya was the kind of person who noticed subtle things. She had spent her whole life noticing subtle things, shifts in tone, changes in breathing, the difference between a door that was locked and a door that was about to be locked. Noticing was how she survived, how she knew when to disappear, when to stay quiet, when to leave a room before the room became dangerous. She knelt beside the loose planks and pressed on them. They lifted easily. Beneath the planks in the cavity between the floor and the ceiling of the millroom below was a wooden crate, handmade, rough sawn, about the size of a milk crate, with rope handles on the sides. It was heavy. Maya pulled it out and set it on the floor. The wood was old and dry and covered in decades of dust. She wiped the dust away with her hand. No markings, no labels, just a crate. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in heavy canvas that had been waxed to keep out moisture, were mason jars. She counted them, 12, each jar sealed with a zinc lid, each one filled with something that caught the pale green light from the windows and held it. Maya sat back on her heels. Her heart was pounding. She didn't know why. She hadn't done anything, hadn't run, hadn't climbed, but her heart was pounding like she'd just sprinted up a hill. She reached for the first jar, lifted it out. It was heavy. She twisted the lid. It didn't want to open. Rust had welded the threads, but she kept turning and finally the seal broke with that sound like a breath being released. Inside coins, old coins, large silver dollars and half dollars, heavy and cool, stacked tight inside the glass. She opened the second jar. Paper money, old bills, rolled tight and packed in so densely the jar weighed several pounds. The third jar, more coins. The fourth, bills. The fifth, a mixture of both. Silver coins layered with folded currency, packed with the care of someone who understood that what they were saving mattered. Maya opened every jar, sitting on the chestnut floor with the forest light coming through the glassless windows and the sound of the creek rising through the stones beneath her. She didn't count the money. Not yet. That would come later. When her hands stopped shaking and her mind stopped racing and she could think clearly enough to add numbers together. But she knew it was a lot. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. At the bottom of the crate beneath the last jar was a leather pouch tied with a piece of twine. Maya's hands were shaking when she picked it up. She untied the twine. The leather was stiff and dry. It cracked slightly when she opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, dry and brittle, the edges brown with age. She unfolded it carefully. The paper wanted to tear, wanted to fall apart in her hands, but she was gentle and it held together. The writing was in pencil, careful and neat, the kind of handwriting that comes from someone who learned to write with a slate and chalk and never forgot the discipline of it. Maya read the letter sitting on the chestnut floor of a building that had been abandoned for 63 years. My name is Samuel Brooks. I have run this mill since 1921. My father ran it before me since 1889. My grandfather built it in 1871 with stones he cut from the creek bed. This money is what I have earned and saved over 40 years of milling corn and wheat for the people of this valley. I put it here because banks are for flatlanders, and I am not a flatlander. If you are reading this, you have found my mill, and you have found my savings. Use them to keep the mill standing. The stones are good, the creek is clean, the wheel can be fixed. A mill is a useful thing. A place that turns grain into flour is a place that feeds people. As long as it stands, someone will be fed. Samuel Brooks, April 1958. Maya read the letter 3 times, then she folded it carefully and held it against her chest. She didn't cry. Maya Stone didn't cry much. She had learned early that crying drew attention, and attention in her house was never a good thing. So she had taught herself not to cry, had pushed it down and down until it became something she didn't know how to do anymore. But she felt something shift inside her, like a wall she hadn't known was there moving aside to reveal a room she hadn't known existed. The room was warm, the room was quiet, the room was hers. She sat there for a long time. The light outside faded. The green glow in the room dimmed to gray and then to darkness. She heard the creek below, constant, unchanging. A sound that had been here long before this building existed and would be here long after it was gone. Samuel Brooks had hidden this money in 1958, 67 years ago. He had written a letter to someone he would never meet and trusted that they would find it, trusted that they would understand, trusted that they would use it the way he intended. He had trusted the stones, he had trusted the creek. He had trusted that a place built to feed people would always draw someone who needed to be fed. Maya pulled the headlamp out of her backpack and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness. She stood up. Her legs were stiff. She'd been sitting for over an hour. She looked around the room, at the stone walls, at the empty window frames, at the chestnut floor with the loose planks still lifted, revealing the cavity where the crate had been hidden. She thought about Samuel Brooks, about 40 years of running a mill, about saving every spare dollar and hiding it under these boards, about writing a letter and trusting the future. She thought about Rick, about the locked door and the garbage bag on the porch. She thought about her mother, about the way she had turned herself into a shadow, about the textbook on animal anatomy still sitting on the shelf above the washing machine, a dream abandoned so long ago it had fossilized. She thought about Ruth, about toast with raspberry jam, about phone calls made on her behalf, about a bakery van that smelled like sourdough and diesel. And she thought about what it meant to be useful. Not useful in the way that being invisible is useful, not useful in the way that not causing trouble is useful, but useful in the real way, the way a mill is useful, the way a building that feeds people is useful. Maya looked at the 12 jars arranged on the floor, at the letter in her hand, at the broken wheel visible through the window, at the grinding stones 1 floor below. She had come here with $10 and nowhere else to go. She had found $32,200 in a purpose. But money was easy, keeping a promise to a dead man. That was the hard part. Maya woke to the sound of rain on a roof that wasn't entirely there. She'd slept in the upstairs room in her sleeping bag on the chestnut floor with her backpack as a pillow. The rain had started sometime after midnight, soft at first, then harder. Now it was coming down steady, and she could hear exactly where the roof was missing, because that's where the rain was coming through. She opened her eyes. Gray dawn light filtered through the window frames. The rain was visible as diagonal lines against the trees outside, and in the corner near the fireplace, water was dripping through the exposed rafters, hitting the floor in a rhythm like a clock ticking. Drip, drip, drip. She sat up. Her body was stiff. The floor was hard and cold, and sleeping on it had left her with an ache in her hip that would probably be there all day. She was still wearing yesterday's clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt and the hoodie with the too big hood. Her boots were beside her sleeping bag, damp from yesterday's hike. The 12 jars were still where she'd left them, lined up against the wall. The letter was in her pocket. She'd kept it there all night, close. Like if she let it go too far away, it might disappear, and she'd wake up and discover this was all a dream. But it wasn't a dream. The jars were real. The money was real. The mill was real. And the roof was leaking. Maya stood up and walked to where the water was coming through. She looked up at the rafters. The wood was dark and wet. Some of it was rotted. She could see daylight through the gaps where shingles were missing. A section maybe 6 feet wide and 10 feet long. Quarter of the roof on the left side. If she didn't fix it, the water would keep coming in, would rot the floor, would damage the walls, would turn this place from a ruin that could be saved into a ruin that couldn't. She had $32,000 hidden under the floorboards, and the first thing she needed to spend it on was shingles. The walk back to the trailhead took 40 minutes. Maya left the garbage bag at the mill. There was no point carrying it back and forth, and took only her backpack with the Ziploc bag of cash and the essentials. The rain had stopped, but everything was wet. The trail was slick with mud. Her boots made sucking sounds with every step. When she got to the parking area, her truck was still there. The 1999 Toyota Tacoma she'd bought 3 days ago for $2,600 from a mechanic in Mars Hill, who'd looked at her like she was either very brave or very lost, and he wasn't sure which. The truck was red, or had been red. Now it was mostly rust red with patches of primer gray where the rust had been sanded down. There was a dent in the passenger door and a crack in the windshield that ran from corner to corner like a river on a map. But the engine ran, and that was all that mattered. Maya had learned to change the oil the day she bought it. The mechanic had shown her how. Lying on her back on a piece of cardboard in his parking lot, unscrewing the drain plug, letting the old oil drain into a pan, replacing the filter, pouring in new oil, 5 quarts of 10W30, change it every 5,000 miles, the mechanic had said, and this truck will run until the sun burns out. Maya believed him. She drove to Marshall, to the building supply store on the main road, a low cinder block building with a gravel parking lot and a hand-painted sign that said Marshall Lumber and Hardware. Inside, the store smelled like sawdust and paint thinner and the particular chemical smell of new plastic. An older man stood behind the counter. 60s, flannel shirt, reading glasses on a chain around his neck. "Help you," he said. "I need roofing materials," Maya said. "Shingles, felt, nails." "How much roof?" "Maybe 60 square feet." He nodded, pulled a calculator from beside the register, started punching numbers. 3-tab shingles, you're looking at about $200. That's materials only. You hiring somebody to install? No, Maya said. "I'm doing it myself." He looked at her over the top of his reading glasses, taking her in, 5 feet tall, 18 years old, wearing jeans and a hoodie and boots that were covered in mud. "You know how to roof?" he asked. "No," Maya said, "but I'll figure it out." He studied her for another moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let me show you what you need." It took 3 days to carry the materials in. Maya loaded the truck with bundles of shingles, rolls of roofing, felt boxes of nails, and a hammer she'd bought at the hardware store. She drove to the trailhead and carried everything in piece by piece, 50 pounds at a time, 2 miles uphill, through mud and over roots and across the creek where it crossed the trail in 2 places. Her shoulders ached. Her legs ached. Her hands developed blisters from the rough twine that held the shingle bundles together. But she kept going. 2 trips a day, morning and afternoon, carrying load after load until everything she needed was stacked on the ground floor of the mill, covered with a tarp to keep it dry. On the 4th day, she started working on the roof. She'd never done this before, had never even watched someone do it. But the man at the hardware store had given her a photocopied instruction sheet, and there were videos she could watch on her phone as long as she hiked back to where there was cell service. So that's what she did. Hiked out, watched videos, hiked back, tried to remember what she'd seen. The first step was removing the damaged shingles. Maya climbed onto the roof using a ladder she'd made from 2x4s and scrap wood she'd found in the mill room. It wasn't a good ladder, it wobbled, but it got her high enough to pull herself onto the roof. The surface was steep, steeper than it looked from the ground. She had to move carefully, testing each step. The old shingles were slippery, and some of them were loose, and if she stepped wrong, she'd slide right off the edge and fall 15 feet onto the rocks below. She pulled off the damaged shingles one by one, prying them up with a flat bar she'd bought at the hardware store. Some came up easy, others were nailed down so hard she had to work the bar underneath and lever them up with all her weight. The nails came out bent and rusted. She dropped them into a bucket tied to her belt. By the end of the first day, she'd cleared the damaged section, exposed the rafters. Some of them were rotted, dark, and soft. She could push her finger into the wood and it would sink in like pushing into mud. Those would have to be replaced. Maya climbed down from the roof and sat on the bank of the creek. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion. She'd been on the roof for 6 hours, moving slowly, carefully. Every muscle in her body was tired. She ate a granola bar and drank water from the creek and looked at the mill. It was hers. She'd signed the deed, paid $10. The building belonged to her. But it didn't feel like hers yet. It felt like something she was borrowing, something she had to earn the right to keep. Replacing the rafters took another week. Maya cut new lumber to length using a handsaw. 2x6s, 8 feet long. She bought them at the lumber yard in Marshall and carried them in one at a time, balanced on her shoulder like a rifle. Each board weighed maybe 15 pounds. It didn't sound like much, but after 2 miles uphill, 15 pounds felt like 50. She installed the new rafters one by one, climbing onto the roof, positioning the board, nailing it into place. It was slow work, tedious. But she got better at it. The first rafter took her 2 hours. The second took 1. By the fifth, she could do it in 40 minutes. When all the rafters were in place, she laid down the roofing felt, black paper that smelled like tar. She rolled it out across the bare wood and nailed it down with broad-headed nails that the man at the hardware store had called cap nails. The paper overlapped at the seams, each row covering the row below it so water would run down and off instead of seeping through. Then came the shingles. Maya started at the bottom edge of the roof and worked her way up. Each shingle was a rectangular strip of asphalt embedded with granules that felt like coarse sand. 3 tabs per shingle. She laid the first row, nailed it down. 4 nails per shingle. Then she laid the second row offsetting it so the tabs didn't line up with the tabs below. The first row was crooked. She could see it as soon as she stepped back. The line wasn't straight. It curved upward on the left side. Not much, maybe half an inch, but enough that if she kept going, the whole roof would be off. Maya stared at it for a long moment. She'd spent an hour laying that row. 40 shingles, 160 nails. Then she pulled out the flat bar and started prying them up, every single one. She did the row again. This time she used a chalk line to mark a straight line across the felt. Snapped it so it left a blue mark. Then she laid the shingles along the line, checked them again, nailed them down. The second row was better. By the 10th row, she had found a rhythm. Nail, slide, overlap, nail, slide, overlap. A pattern her hands learned before her brain understood. She stopped thinking about what she was doing and just did it, moving across the roof like she was weaving, like the shingles were threads and the roof was a piece of cloth she was making whole. 3 weeks after she'd started, the last shingle went down. Maya climbed off the roof and stood in the clearing beside the mill, looked up. The left side of the roof was complete, solid, unbroken. New black shingles covering the old gray rafters. It wasn't perfect. Some of the lines were a little crooked. Some of the shingles didn't quite line up. But it was done, and it was hers. She sat on the bank of the creek and ate a sandwich. Peanut butter on bread she'd bought in Marshall 5 days ago. The bread was stale, but she didn't care. She chewed slowly and looked at the roof and felt something she had never felt before. Pride. Not the kind of pride that comes from being told you did well. Not the kind that comes from getting a good grade or winning something or being praised. But the kind that comes from building something with your own hands. From taking a problem and solving it. From looking at a thing that was broken and making it whole. Nobody could take this from her. Nobody could lock it in a room or put it in a garbage bag on a porch. It was nailed to the rafters. Permanent. She had built a roof. Not a perfect roof, not a professional roof, but a roof that would keep the rain out and the warmth in. And that was enough. The windows came next, 8 of them, 2 on each wall of the upper room. The frames were still good. Stone frames that had been there since 1871. But the glass was gone, all of it, broken or taken or simply dissolved by time. Maya measured each opening, width and height, wrote the numbers down in a notebook she kept in her backpack. Then she drove to Asheville, to a glass shop on the south side of town, a small place wedged between a pawn shop and a laundromat. The man who ran the shop was younger than she expected, maybe 30. He wore a canvas apron and had cuts on his hands from handling glass all day. Maya showed him the measurements. "Can you cut these?" she asked. He looked at the numbers, nodded. "Single pane, double pane, single. It'll be cheaper, but it won't insulate as well." "That's fine." He calculated the cost, told her a number. It was more than she wanted to spend, but less than she'd feared. She paid in cash. Bills from one of the jars, old 20s that smelled like dust and time. I can have them ready in 3 days, the man said. I'll come back, Maya said. 3 days later, she drove back to Asheville. The glass was ready, 8 panes, each one wrapped in brown paper and cardboard. The man helped her load them into the truck, showed her how to stack them so they wouldn't shift during the drive. Be careful with these, he said. Glass doesn't give second chances. Maya drove back to the trailhead, parked, looked at the 8 panes in the bed of the truck. There was no way to carry them all at once. She'd have to make 8 trips. She wrapped the first pane in a blanket, held it flat against her chest like she was carrying a sleeping child. Started walking. 2 miles. Uphill, carrying glass, every step careful, every root and rock a potential disaster. If she tripped, the glass would break. If she slipped, the glass would break. If she stumbled or fell or lost her balance for even a moment, the glass would break. She didn't trip, didn't slip, didn't fall. She made it to the mill, set the glass down gently on the upstairs floor, unwrapped it, checked it, not a scratch. Then she walked back and did it again, and again, and again. 8 trips, 16 miles total. By the time she carried the last pane and the sun was setting and her arms felt like they were going to fall off. But all 8 panes were intact, leaning against the wall, waiting to be installed. Installing the glass took another week. Maya had bought glazing putty at the hardware store, a gray clay-like substance that came in a tub. She'd also bought glazing points, tiny triangular pieces of metal that held the glass in place while the putty dried. She worked on one window at a time. First, she cleaned out the old putty from the stone frame. Most of it was so old it had hardened into something closer to concrete than clay. She had to chip it out with a chisel, carefully, so she didn't damage the stone. Then she applied a thin bead of new putty to the frame, pressed the glass into place, pushed glazing points into the wood every few inches to hold the glass while the putty set, then applied more putty around the edge of the glass, smoothing it with her thumb, creating a seal. The first window took her 4 hours. The second took 3. By the 8th, she could do it in 2. When the last window was in, Maya stood in the center of the upstairs room and looked around. Light poured through the glass, clear and bright and green from the forest outside. The room was transformed. Before it had been a stone box open to the weather. Now it was a room, an actual room, with walls and a roof and windows that caught the light and held it. She walked to one of the windows and looked out. The forest stretched away in every direction, endless. The trees so thick she couldn't see more than 50 yards, but she could hear the creek. Always the creek, running below, constant, unchanging. The room filled with green light, like being inside an emerald. Month 3 was the floor in the fireplace. Maya pulled up the loose chestnut planks near the fireplace, the ones that had hidden the crate. Beneath them were the joists, heavy beams running perpendicular to the floor. Some of them were solid, dark with age but still hard and strong. Others had started to rot, soft spots where water had gotten in, where time had done its work. She replaced 2 joists, cut new lumber to length, slid the old joists out and the new ones in, nailed them into place with 16-penny nails that took 3 swings of the hammer to drive home. Then she relaid the floor, the same chestnut planks. She didn't want to replace them. They were original, from 1871, cut from trees that had been growing here when the Civil War ended. She sanded them by hand, using sandpaper and a sanding block and her own muscle, kneeling on the floor, moving in long strokes, back and forth, back and forth. The old finish came off in fine brown dust that settled on everything. It got in her hair and her clothes and the creases of her hands. She wore a bandana over her nose and mouth, but still she could taste it. Dust and wood and time. Slowly the grain appeared, dark and warm, rippled with the marks of the adze that had shaped it 150 years ago. The wood glowed, even under the coating of dust. It glowed like it had light trapped inside it. When the sanding was done, Maya swept the floor, then wiped it down with a damp cloth, then let it dry. The planks looked new and old at the same time, new in their smoothness, old in their color and grain and the history they carried. She didn't seal them, didn't stain them, just left them bare, the way they'd been made. The fireplace chimney was clogged, 100 years of creosote and soot and bird nests and leaves. Maya cleaned it out by hand. scraping decades of buildup from the inside of the stone chimney with a wire brush taped to a long branch. She worked from below, standing in the fireplace, looking up, pushing the brush up the flue and pulling it back down. Black flakes rained down, covering her, covering the floor. She wore goggles and the bandana, but still the soot got everywhere. In her eyes, in her nose, in her mouth. She tasted it for days afterward, bitter and acrid and old. But slowly the chimney cleared. She could see daylight at the top, a small circle of sky. She tested the draw by lighting a small fire, just twigs and dry leaves. The smoke rose, pulled straight up and out. The chimney was clear. The fireplace worked. Maya sat on the floor and watched the fire burn. Small flames, yellow and orange. The heat felt good. It was April now, but the nights were still cold. She'd been sleeping in her sleeping bag with all her clothes on, waking up stiff and sore. But now she had a fireplace. She could make heat, could cook, could dry clothes, could sit in front of the fire on cold nights and feel warm. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Month 4 was water and power. For water, Maya didn't need to run a pipe. She had a creek, clean mountain water running 20 feet from the front door. But she wanted water inside, wanted a sink, wanted to be able to wash dishes and fill a pot without walking outside. She built a counter along one wall, used salvaged lumber from the mill room, 2x4s and plywood, rough but solid. She installed a stainless steel sink she'd bought at a salvage yard in Asheville for $20. Then she installed a hand pump, the kind you see in old farmhouses, cast iron, with a long handle you push down to draw water up. She ran a pipe from the pump down through the floor, through the mill room, out through the stone wall, into the creek. It took her 3 days to get it working. The first time she tried, nothing happened. She pumped and pumped, but no water came. The pipe was too high. Gravity couldn't pull the water up that far. She adjusted the pipe, lowered it, tried again. This time water came, cold and clear and fast. It poured out of the spout and into the sink, and she stood there watching it like it was magic. Running water. She had running water. For power, she started small. A single solar panel she'd bought online and had shipped to Ruth's bakery. 50 watts, about the size of a window. She mounted it on the south-facing wall above the roofline using brackets she'd made from scrap metal, ran a wire down through a hole she drilled in the wall, connected it to a battery she kept in the mill room, a deep cycle marine battery, the kind used in boats. The panel charged this battery during the day. The battery powered a light at night, a single LED bulb hanging from the ceiling. It wasn't much, but it was enough to read by, enough to cook by, enough to not have to rely on the headlamp and candles. She also powered a radio, a small transistor radio she'd found at a thrift shop in Hot Springs. It picked up exactly one station, a public radio affiliate out of Asheville, classical music in the evenings, news in the mornings. Maya would sit on the floor in front of the fireplace and listen to the radio and feel connected to the world beyond the forest, to people and cities and events happening somewhere else. It was comforting, knowing the world was still out there, still turning, even though she was here, alone, 2 miles from the nearest road. The grinding stones sat in the center of the mill room like monuments. Maya cleaned and wiped away decades of dust and cobwebs and mouse droppings, oiled the wooden frame they sat on. The wood was oak, dark and dense. It had warped slightly over the years, but it was still solid. She liked the weight of the stones, the solidity, 2 pieces of granite, each one cut by hand from a single block, fitted together so precisely that when they turned, they could crush a kernel of corn into flour as fine as talcum powder. They'd been doing this for 90 years before Samuel Brooks wrote his letter, and they could do it again if someone fixed the wheel. Maya looked at the wheel through the window. Broken, moss-covered, 3 paddles missing. The axle cracked. Fixing it would be the hardest thing she'd done yet, but she'd come this far. And Samuel's letter said the wheel could be fixed, so she'd fix it. It took 3 weeks. Maya started by studying the wheel, how it was built, how it was supposed to work. She found books at the library in Hot Springs, old books about grist mills and water power. She read them at night by the light of her LED bulb, taking notes, drawing diagrams. The wheel was an overshot design. Water came in from above. hit the paddles. The weight of the water turned the wheel turned the axle turned the gears. The gears turned the grinding stones, simple in theory, complicated in practice. The first step was replacing the broken paddles. Maya cut new ones from white oak she felled on the hillside above the mill. Young trees, straight-grained. She shaped each paddle with a draw knife, a two-handled blade you pull toward yourself, shaving away wood in long, curling strips. It was slow work, meditative. She could feel the grain of the wood under the blade, could see the shape emerging from the rough lumber. She made 3 paddles, fitted them into the wheel frame with wooden pegs. No nails, no screws, just friction and geometry holding them in place. Next was the axle. The old one was cracked straight through, split by age and weather and the stress of turning under load for decades. It couldn't be repaired, it had to be replaced. Maya cut a new axle from locust, the hardest wood she could find, 8 inches in diameter, 6 feet long. She turned it on a makeshift lathe she rigged using the truck's spare tire as a drive wheel and her drill as a motor. It wasn't precise, but it was round enough, smooth enough. She removed the old axle. It took 2 days. The iron brackets holding it were rusted solid. She had to soak them in penetrating oil and heat them with a torch she'd borrowed from Tom Hargrove, the farmer who'd brought her corn to test the stones. Tom had appeared one morning, walking up the trail, carrying a burlap sack. He was 55, weathered, spoke in short sentences. "Heard you're fixing the Brooks place," he'd said. "Trying to," Maya said. "Brought you some corn for when you get the stones running." He'd stayed for coffee, told her about Samuel, about how his grandfather had brought grain here for 40 years, about how Samuel had never charged more than a share of the flour. He measured his worth, Tom said, by how many people he could feed. Then he'd left. But he came back the next week, and the week after. Always with something: tools, advice, stories about how things used to work. He never stayed long, but he was there when she needed him. Installing the new axle was a 2-person job, but Maya only had one person: herself. She rigged a pulley system, ropes and blocks borrowed from Tom. She lifted the axle inch by inch, positioned it in the brackets, bolted it in place. It took all day. Her hands were raw from the rope. Her arms shook from the strain. But when it was done, the axle was in place. The wheel was whole. The last step was reconnecting the mechanism, the wooden gears and iron shafts that transferred power from the wheel to the grinding stones. The old system was partially collapsed. Maya rebuilt it piece by piece, replacing rotted gears with new ones she'd cut and shaped by hand, realigning the shafts, greasing the bearings with lard she'd bought in Marshall. On a Tuesday morning in late May, she opened the sluice gate. Water hit the paddles. The wheel groaned, creaked, started to turn. Slowly at first, then faster. The axle turned, the gears engaged, the iron shafts spun, and in the mill room the grinding stones began to rotate. A low, heavy rumbling sound that Maya could feel in her chest, in the soles of her feet through the stone floor. She stood in the doorway and watched a machine that had been dead for 60 years come back to life. The wheel turned. Water dripped from the paddles in silver arcs. The stones ground against each other with a sound like distant thunder. Maya understood for the first time what it meant to be useful. Not useful in the way that being invisible is useful, not useful in the way that not causing trouble is useful, but useful in the real way. The way a mill is useful, the way a building that feeds people is useful. She closed the sluice gate. The wheel slowed, stopped, but it worked. The mill worked, and 6 months after she'd bought it for $10, the Brooks mill was alive again. The first batch of flour came out golden, not white, not the pale, colorless powder you buy in plastic bags at the grocery store, but golden, the color of late afternoon sunlight, coarse and fragrant and full of flavor that tasted like the grain it came from instead of like nothing. Maya stood in the mill room and watched it pour from the spout between the grinding stones. A steady stream, filling the wooden bucket she'd placed underneath. The sound of the stones was everywhere, that low rumbling, that vibration you felt in your bones. Tom had brought the corn 2 weeks ago, 50 pounds of it in a burlap sack, heirloom variety, bloody butcher he'd called it, deep red kernels that looked almost purple in certain light. My grandfather grew this, Tom had said. His grandfather before him. Samuel used to grind it for us every fall. Now Maya was grinding it. The same stones, the same wheel, the same creek turning, the same machinery it had turned for 150 years. When the bucket was full, she closed the sluice gate. The wheel slowed and stopped. The stones went quiet. The mill settled into silence except for the constant murmur of the creek below. Maya lifted the bucket. The flour was still warm from the friction of the stones. She scooped up a handful, let it run through her fingers. It felt different than store-bought flour, coarser, more substantial, like it had weight and presence instead of just being fine powder. She brought a pinch to her mouth, tasted it. Corn, sweet and earthy and rich, the way corn is supposed to taste when it hasn't been processed into oblivion. This was what Samuel had made, what his father had made, what his grandfather had made. For 90 years, feeding the people of this valley, turning grain into flour, turning hunger into sustenance. And now she was doing it too. Ruth sold the flour at Honey and Rye. Maya had called her from the payphone in Hot Springs, told her the mill was running, told her she had flour to sell. Ruth had driven up the next day, parked at the trailhead, hiked the 2 miles in. She was 62 and not built for hiking, but she made it without complaint. When she saw the mill, she stopped in the clearing and put her hands on her hips. "Well, I'll be damned," she said. She walked around the building, looked at the new roof, the new windows, the water wheel turning slowly in the creek. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, looked at the chestnut floor, the fireplace, the hand pump at the sink. "You did all this yourself?" Ruth asked. "Yes, ma'am." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "Samuel would be proud," she said. They sat outside on the bank of the creek. Maya made coffee on the camp stove, strong and black. Ruth drank it and looked at the forest and didn't say much, just sat there, taking it in. Finally, she said, "Bring me 20 pounds to start. I'll sell it at the bakery. $6 a pound. We'll see how it goes." $6 seems high, Maya said. "It's stone ground. It's heirloom corn. It's made in a mill that's been here since 1871. Ruth looked at her. "People will pay for quality. Trust me." Maya brought her 20 pounds the following week, carried it out in cloth bags she'd sewn herself from canvas she'd bought in Marshall. Ruth put it on the shelf at Honey and Rye with a handwritten sign that said Brooks Mill Stone Ground Corn Flour. It sold out in 3 days. Ruth called Maya from the bakery phone. "Bring me 40 pounds next time." The 40 pounds sold out in 5 days. "Bring me 60. By the end of summer, Maya was grinding 100 pounds a week. Tom brought corn. Other farmers started bringing corn too. And wheat, heirloom varieties with names like Red Fife and Turkey Red, grains that had been grown in these mountains for generations. That had been ground in this mill back when Samuel was alive, back when his father was alive. The farmers brought their grain to the trailhead, left it in sacks. Maya hiked it in 50 pounds at a time, ground it on the stones, hiked the flour back out, delivered it to Ruth. Ruth sold it, gave Maya the money. Maya kept half, gave the other half back to the farmers as their share. The way Samuel had done it, the way it had always been done. It wasn't much money, maybe $200 a week, but it was enough for food, for supplies, for the occasional repair, for the slow, steady work of turning a ruin into a home. People found her, the way mountain people always find each other. Slowly, through side channels, word of mouth, a cousin who knew someone who'd heard that the old Brooks Mill was running again. Tom brought friends, other farmers, men and women in their 50s and 60s who remembered when their parents or grandparents had brought grain here, who remembered the sound of the grinding stones carrying down the valley on quiet mornings. They came to see it, to hear it, to remember. A woman named Eleanor Winters hiked up on a Tuesday morning in late September. She was 84 years old, wore rubber boots and a wide-brimmed sun hat, carried a jar of sourwood honey in her backpack. Maya was in the mill room when she arrived, heard footsteps on the trail, looked up and saw this small, wiry woman standing in the doorway, not even breathing hard from the 2-mile hike. "You're the one who fixed the mill," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. I heard the wheel was turning again, had to see it with my own eyes." Maya showed her around. The mill room, the grinding stones, the mechanism, the wheel outside. Eleanor walked slowly, looking at everything, touching the stones, running her hand along the wooden frame. Then Maya opened the sluice gate. Water hit the paddles. The wheel began to turn. The stones began to grind. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, put her hand on one of the grinding stones, closed her eyes, stood that way for a long time, not speaking, just feeling the vibration through her palm. When she opened her eyes, they were wet. "That's the same sound," she said, "exactly the same sound. I used to hear it from my bedroom window when I was a girl. My mother would send me up here with a sack of corn, and I'd sit on that rock by the creek and wait while Samuel ground it. He always gave me a biscuit." She paused. "I'm 84 years old, and I can still taste that biscuit." Eleanor came back every 2 weeks after that, always with something: honey, a jar of pickled ramps, a bag of dried apples. Once a pair of wool socks she'd knitted herself, thick gray socks with red stripes at the top. She never called ahead. There was no way to call ahead. No phone, no cell service. She just appeared on the trail, rubber boots and sun hat, carrying whatever she'd decided to bring. She'd sit with Maya on the bank of the creek, drink coffee, tell stories about growing up in these mountains in the 1940s and 50s, about her husband who died 20 years ago, about her children who'd moved away to cities and rarely came back, about the garden she still kept, the chickens she still raised, the life she'd built in the same valley where she'd been born. One afternoon in October, sitting by the creek while the wheel turned behind them, Eleanor said, "You know, I used to live up here." Here. Not in the mill, but close. There was a cabin about half a mile downstream. My husband built it. We lived there for 2 years, 1964 and 65. She was quiet for a moment. "He wasn't a good man," she said. "He drank, got mean when he drank. One night it got bad enough that I left, walked out in the dark, came here, to the mill." Samuel was still alive then, just barely. He was old, sick, but he let me stay, gave me a place to sleep, didn't ask questions, didn't judge. Just let me be. Eleanor looked at the mill, at the stone walls, at the wheel turning in the creek. "I stayed 2 months, helped him with the grinding, kept the place clean. He didn't talk much, but he was kind. When I was ready to leave, he gave me $50 and told me to go somewhere safe." She turned to Maya. "This place saves people," she said. "It saved me. It saved Samuel's father during the Depression when he had nowhere else to go. Now it's saving you. Don't ever think you owe it. It owes you nothing. You're just keeping the creek flowing." Winter came. The first snow fell in early December. Maya woke to silence, a different kind of silence than usual. The creek was still there, still murmuring, but muffled, softer. She looked out the window. Everything was white. 6 inches had fallen overnight. More was coming down. Fat flakes drifting through the trees like ash from a distant fire. Maya had prepared. She'd cut and split wood all through October and November, stacked it under a tarp beside the mill. Oak and hickory, dense hardwoods that burned hot and slow, enough to last through the winter. She'd also stocked food, rice and beans and oatmeal and flour, canned vegetables, dried fruit, coffee, things that would keep, things that didn't need refrigeration. The trail became harder to walk. The packed earth turned to frozen mud and then to snow that drifted 2 feet deep in places. Maya wore the wool socks Eleanor had knitted, wore boots she'd waterproofed with beeswax, walked the trail every few days for supplies, 2 miles each way, learning the rhythm of winter hiking the way she'd learned the rhythm of everything else, by doing it until it became natural. The mill house held the cold well. The stone walls were 2 feet thick, slow to cool and slow to warm, which meant the temperature inside stayed stable regardless of what was happening outside. The wood stove kept the upstairs room warm enough to sleep comfortably even on nights when the temperature outside dropped to single digits. She burned oak and hickory, learned to bank the fire at night, covering the coals with ash so they'd stay hot until morning. Then she'd wake and add kindling and blow gently until the flames caught. Feed the fire, keep a pot of water on the stove at all times for tea and washing. On the coldest nights, she'd lie in bed and listen to the creek. The sound changed in winter, lower, thicker, muffled by ice, but it never stopped. Even when the temperature dropped below zero and the surface froze solid in places she could hear the water moving underneath. Insistent and constant, pushing through the dark. It was the most reliable sound she'd ever heard. More reliable than any voice. More reliable than any promise. The creek kept going because that's what water does. It keeps going. On a Saturday in late October before the snow came, Maya sat on a flat rock beside the creek and watched the sun go down through the trees. The forest was on fire with color. The maples red, the poplars gold, the oaks bronze. The creek caught the colors and carried them downstream in long, rippling streaks of light. Behind her, the water wheel turned slowly, creaking softly, pushing water off its paddles in silver arcs that caught the last of the light. Inside the mill house, the wood stove was burning. The windows glowed warm amber against the darkening forest. 6 months. That's how long she'd been here. 6 months since she'd signed the deed at the courthouse in Marshall. Since she'd walked 2 miles up a mountain trail with everything she owned in a garbage bag and a backpack. 6 months since she'd found 12 jars under the floorboards and a letter written by a man who'd been dead for 67 years. Maya pulled the letter from her pocket. She kept it with her always. The paper was soft now from being folded and unfolded so many times. The pencil writing had faded in places, but the words were still there. Use it to keep the mill standing. She'd done that. The roof was solid. The windows were in. The wheel was turning. The stones were grinding grain into flour the way they'd been doing since 1871. The stones are good. The creek is clean. They were. Both of them. Exactly as Samuel had said they would be. A mill is a useful thing. Maya understood that now. Understood it in a way she couldn't have 6 months ago. A mill wasn't just a building, it was a function, a purpose, a place that took one thing and turned it into another. That took grain and made flour. That took hunger and made food. Useful. She'd spent her whole life being told she wasn't useful, being told to be quiet, to be small, to take up less space, to need less, to be invisible. But she wasn't invisible anymore. She was a miller. She ground grain. She made flour. She fed people. That was useful. That mattered. 2 weeks later, on a cold November afternoon, a young couple appeared on the trail. Maya was outside splitting wood when she heard voices. She looked up and saw them. Mid-20s, expensive hiking gear, the kind of people who looked like they were on their way to a photo shoot for an outdoor magazine. They stopped when they saw the mill, stared at it. The man pulled out his phone and took pictures. Maya set down the axe and walked over. "Can I help you?" she said. "Oh my God," the woman said. "Is this place yours?" "Yes. It's beautiful. Like incredibly beautiful. How long have you lived here?" "About 6 months." The couple looked at each other, then back at Maya. "We're looking for property in the area," the man said. "Somewhere remote, off-grid. We want to build a retreat, get away from the city on weekends." Maya didn't say anything. "Would you be interested in selling?" he asked. "No. We'd pay well. We're talking serious money, more than this place is worth on paper." "How much?" Maya asked, not because she was interested, but because she was curious what they thought it was worth. $120,000, the man said. "Cash. We could close in 30 days. Maya looked at him, at the expensive jacket, the brand new boots that had probably never seen mud before today, the phone in his hand that cost more than she'd spent on the entire roof. $120,000. 12 times what she'd found under the floorboards. 1,200 times what she'd paid for the place. Enough money to go anywhere, do anything. Buy a house in a city, go to college, start a business. Leave this place behind and never look back. "It's not for sale," Maya said. "You're young," the woman said. "Don't you want to travel? See the world, do something with your life." Maya looked at the mill, at the stone walls, at the wheel turning in the creek, at the smoke rising from the chimney. "I am doing something with my life," she said. "But you could do so much more with this money. You could—" "This isn't a house," Maya said. "It's a mill. It feeds people. That's what it does. That's what it's been doing for 150 years. And that's what it's going to keep doing." She picked up the axe. "Come back in 40 years, she said. "Maybe we'll talk then." The couple left. Maya heard them on the trail, talking, the man's voice saying something about wasted potential and the woman laughing. She went back to splitting wood. They didn't understand, and that was fine. They didn't need to understand. This place wasn't about money. It had never been about money. Samuel hadn't saved $32,000 because he wanted to be rich. He'd saved it because he wanted the mill to keep standing, because he knew that as long as it stood, people would be fed. And Maya had used that money the way he'd intended. Not to get rich, not to escape, but to keep the promise he'd made to the future. The mill was standing, the stones were good, the creek was clean, and people were being fed. That was enough. December brought deep cold and heavy snow. The creek slowed but never stopped. Ice formed at the edges, thin sheets that broke and reformed every night. But underneath the water kept moving, dark and fast and cold. Maya spent the long evenings in front of the fireplace, reading, listening to the radio, writing in a journal she'd started keeping, recording what she did each day, what she learned, what broke and how she fixed it. She wrote about the roof, about carrying glass 2 miles through the forest, about the grinding stones and the sound they made, about Tom and Eleanor and Ruth, about the farmers who brought grain and the people who bought flour. She wrote about being alone, about how it felt different now than it had 6 months ago, how it felt less like exile and more like choice, how the silence wasn't empty, but full, full of the creek and the wind and the fire crackling and the wheel turning. She wrote about Samuel, about the letter, about the jars hidden under the floor, about the trust he'd placed in a future he would never see. And she wrote about what it meant to be small. She'd been small her whole life, small and quiet and easy to overlook, made small by other people, by Rick's anger, by her mother's fear, by a world that seemed designed for people bigger and louder and more confident than she was. But she was beginning to understand that small didn't mean weak. The creek beside the mill was small, a narrow stream you could jump across in most places. But it had been grinding grain for 150 years, had been carving stones since before anyone had built anything on its banks. It was patient, steady, it never stopped. And over time, it had shaped the entire valley. That's the thing about water. It doesn't fight, it doesn't push, it just keeps going, finds the path of least resistance, and follows it. And over years and decades and centuries, it changes the shape of the world. That's the thing about people like Maya. People who've been made small by someone else's anger or fear or indifference. They don't break, they flow. They find a way around the obstacle and they keep moving. And eventually, without anyone noticing, they build something that lasts. On a cold morning in late February, almost exactly 1 year after she'd been thrown out of Rick's house, Maya sat at the wooden table upstairs and wrote a letter. She used a pencil, the same kind of pencil Samuel had used. She wrote carefully, slowly, making sure every word was clear. When she was done, she read it over. My name is Maya Stone. I bought this mill in February 2024 for $10 when I had nowhere else to go. I found money here, $32,200 saved by Samuel Brooks. I used it to fix the roof, the windows, the wheel, and the stones. The mill runs again. If you're reading this, you found this place the way I found it, probably when you needed it most. Use it. Keep it standing. The stones are good. The creek is clean, the wheel turns. A mill is a useful thing. As long as it stands, someone will be fed. Maya Stone, October 2025. She folded the letter, put it in a new leather pouch she'd bought in Marshall, tied it with twine. Then she went to the spot near the fireplace where the floorboards lifted, the same spot where she'd found Samuel's crate. She'd put the crate back after she'd emptied it, had relayed the floorboards over it. Now she lifted them again. She put the letter in the bottom of the crate, in the same spot where Samuel's letter had been. Then she covered it with the canvas, put the crate back in the cavity, lowered the floorboards into place. The next person would find it, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 50, maybe not until after she was dead and gone and this place had passed to someone else. But they'd find it, and they'd understand what it meant. That's how it worked. That's how it had always worked. One person finding what another had left behind, one generation trusting the next. The mill standing because someone cared enough to keep it standing. Maya walked downstairs, outside, stood by the creek in the cold February air. The water wheel turned slowly. The creek murmured over the stones. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line that dissolved into the sky. She thought about Samuel Brooks, About 40 years of running a mill, about saving every spare dollar and hiding it under the floorboards, about writing a letter to someone he would never meet and trusting that they would understand. She thought about Rick, about the locked door, the garbage bag, the $10 bill she'd set on the courthouse counter. She thought about Ruth, about toast with raspberry jam, about phone calls and bakery vans, and believing in an 18-year-old girl with nowhere else to go. She thought about Eleanor, about rubber boots and sun hats and honey and the way this place saves people. She thought about what it means to be small, about water and mills and people who don't break but flow, who find a way forward, who keep going because that's what you do. You keep going. The creek beside her was small, narrow, easy to overlook, but it had been here for thousands of years, had carved this valley, had shaped the stone, had powered the wheel, had ground the grain, had fed the people, and it would be here for thousands more. Patient, steady, unchanging. Maya Stone was 18 years old when she was thrown out with nothing but a backpack and $10. She spent that $10 on a crumbling mill on a creek in the mountains of North Carolina. It was the best $10 she ever spent. Not because of the money she found, not because of the roof she built or the wheel she fixed, but because she learned what Samuel knew, that the stones are good, that the creek is clean, that useful things last, and that small, stubborn, persistent things, watermills people like them, don't break. They just keep flowing. And eventually they carve valleys. Spring came, the snow melted, the forest turned green, wildflowers appeared along the trail, trillium and bloodroot and wild ginger. The creek ran high with snowmelt, fast and cold and loud. Maya opened the sluice gate. The wheel turned. The stones ground. Flour poured golden into the bucket. Farmers brought grain. Ruth sold flour. Eleanor brought honey. Tom stopped by on a Thursday morning, stood in the mill room, listened to the stones. My grandfather would be glad to hear this sound again, he said. Mine too, Maya said, even though she'd never known her grandfather, even though she had no idea if he would have cared about mills or stones or creeks or any of it. But standing there, in that room, with the wheel turning and the stones grinding and the creek flowing beneath her feet, she felt connected to something larger than herself, to the people who'd built this place, to the people who'd kept it running, to the people who'd brought grain and taken flour and fed their families, to Samuel Brooks and his father and his grandfather, to everyone who'd understood that a mill is a useful thing, that a place that feeds people matters, that some things are worth keeping standing. Maya was 19 now. She'd been at the mill for just over a year. She'd fixed the roof and the windows and the floor and the wheel. She'd learned to grind grain and make flour and survive in the woods through winter. She'd built a life, not the life anyone expected, not the life anyone would have chosen for her, but hers. The wheel turned. The stones ground. The creek flowed. And Maya Stone stood in the doorway of a 150-year-old gristmill and watched the morning light filter green through the trees and felt for the first time in her life like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, being exactly who she was supposed to be, useful.